have written, and they're going to be taking advantage of the recording. So, and Michael, just so we don't do what we thought we were going to do the last time, maybe you should start.
That sounds like a great idea. Let me just apologize in advance if there are any technical difficulties. I usually don't have any issues, but I was running a course this morning and it was glitching out in a big way. So I apologize in advance if I cut out or something and need to come back in.
What was the problem?
I couldn't figure, I think, I hate to say it because for those like John and yourself who are facilitators, I've been doing a lot of tweaking to the presentations and adding a lot of additional things in terms of content. Not a ton, but some additional things. And I think having all that open on my screen and using video and all that was very processor intense. So I tried to close it all, and I think it solved the problem, but we'll see.
Okay, because we've been having a little difficulty with Zoom the last couple of weeks, so I didn't know if it was a Zoom technical issue.
I don't think so. And this was the UNESCO training, so it was the first time that I was on where these people were from all over the world, and usually they're the ones with the technical issues, and, and this time it was me, so equal opportunity.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead, if you don't mind, and share my screen.
Yep, absolutely.
So what I thought I would do is just run through a few slides that we use at the very beginning of CIT, and to talk a little bit about what we call skill 1. See if I can get it. There you go, it's advancing. So I mentioned this briefly last time that we have 3 different series, and each of these skills builds on the previous skill. And then each series is kind of a building block towards creating compassionate systems. So we start with self-cultivation and the skills of self-cultivation. We move into which kind of ends with self-compassion, which gives us the foundation that we need in order to begin relating to others. And there we start with common humanity because we want to level the playing field. And actually, maybe a little pet peeve of mine is I think oftentimes it's not a lack of compassion that's an issue in the world, but a lack of impartiality and common humanity. So we start there as we're moving into these other skills. And that ultimately builds us towards compassion for others. And then, but compassion is a motivation. It's I really want to help people. I want to alleviate suffering in the world, but it doesn't tell us necessarily how to do it. And sometimes we might cause harm with our actions. We might not know the best place. We might have unintended consequences. So then we get into how do we look at a systems approach so that we can come to a solution of how we want to engage compassionately in a way that is going to have the most benefit for the most amount of people. We started all with the body, and this ties in also with the science of compassion, because this skill is really rooted in how our body affects the quality of our mind and how the body relates to our autonomic nervous system in particular. And so I want to start by giving more of a kind of a model that we use as a shorthand to help us understand where we are at any particular time. And we'll go ahead and let's make this interactive. So when I say the word resilience to you or resilient, what does that mean to you?
Just remind a lot of people that your microphones are off.
Yeah, so if you want, just feel free to unmute and throw in some words or a phrase or a concept. No right, wrong answers. This is all how it relates to you. One of the things, by the way, and then I'm going to get to Elaine, one of the things that we emphasize throughout CIT is that there are no definitions of these words that come down from on high that say this is the right answer. Words, like a lot of things that we're talking about, are human constructs. So these are words that we define within CIT, but it doesn't mean there are not other definitions outside of CIT. Elaine, would you like to share? You seem like you did.
Sure. So I think resiliency is, in a large aspect, the flexibility of our mind and the ability to see things from a different perspective and just being open to seeing things in a different way, because when things happen, and if they haven't worked in the past, you know, they say what the definition of, I don't know, whatever, insanity, trying the same thing and expecting a different result. So it's all about the flexibility of our mind to choose again.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, great. So that's like a mental agility that you're able to employ in difficult situations. And I love that. I love that. Anybody else want to chime in?
Well, similar lines, the ability to bounce back.
Yes, that's a great one.
That's a really important piece for me, that you can come back no matter what. Right.
Yes,
Right.
Excellent. That's a great part of it. Marge?
I was thinking about a gyroscope as a model.
Yeah.
A kind of ability to get back on center, even if you've been tilted.
Yeah, so you're knocked a little bit, but you're able to wind back upright. Excellent. Anyone else? Okay, so we have this concept, and I just noticed in the corner of my eye there's a chat going, but I'm not going to focus on that. So maybe if Marilyn wants to jump in on those, that would be great. So the idea is that those are all great answers, and so you can think about, I don't know about you, but I know from my life there are times in my life where I'm feeling resilient, and in that resilient zone for me. And again, it's defined differently for everybody. Everyone has their own resilient zone. But in that resilient zone, I can have a full range of emotions. And I still am being my best self. I can still see the world clearly. I can still, as Elaine said, I can see multiple perspectives to an issue. I'm not like locked in on only my perspective. I can also bounce back, as you guys were talking about. And it doesn't mean that I don't feel some sadness, or I don't feel some joy, or I might not even feel some agitation, but I'm still in that zone where I'm feeling I can get through this day and I can be my best self. I don't know about you guys, but I don't particularly stay in that zone all the time. I'd like to stay in that zone most of the time, because that's the zone in which I think I am the kindest to people. I'm best prepared to take care of myself and others. But oftentimes there could be like a triggering event, some sort of stressful event. And when that happens, this is more what I look like, right? I can go way up high, what we call knocked up high, out of my resilient zone, or I can get way down low and knocked down low. And so what we mean by that is, by getting knocked up high, it's where I'm starting to get agitated, angry, activated, excited, you know, but in a way that's kind of overstimulated. And that would be what it would look like for me to be knocked up high. I can also get knocked down low, which is kind of the other end of that spectrum. It's kind of feeling, for me, it's feeling some kind of numbness, kind of lethargic, not wanting to move around a lot, not wanting maybe to get out of bed, because I'm just kind of down. And interestingly, there are different events in my life that cause these different scenarios to happen, but there are some that actually cause both. So there might be something, and I'll share this story because it's to me, to this point, still the best example I've ever heard of how this can happen in one event. We have a facilitator at Phillips Men's Prison, and he was facilitating the course for the first time to another group of guys. And he was explaining this slide, and he said, well, you know when Officer Telfair comes on the compound and you see her from across the way, and all of a sudden you're like going, oh my God, here, you know, no matter what happens, something's gonna, so you walk by her and then she gets into your face and she tells you your shirt shouldn't be tucked in the way it's tucked in, and you got to do this and you got to do that. And you just get so angry, you get so upset. And then eventually it ends, and then you go back to your bunk, and you're sitting in your bunk and you start to think, what am I doing in this place? How did I get here? And you get really down. And every guy in the room was like, yep, got it, totally, I got this slide. And so that's the idea, is that everybody has their own map, their own set of triggers, their own life experiences that kind of dictate for them where they are. So before I go on from that, does this make sense? Does anyone have any thoughts they want to share? Does this ring true for people? I see a lot of heads nodding. which is good. Makes sense?
Yes, if I could share about the hurricanes, because we've had, I'd say, maybe one major hurricane for the last couple of years, and the damage has been, in the billions of dollars and lives lost, thousands. So I guess I could share that, living on the coast of Florida is wonderful, except that one hurricane that's coming and we really don't know where it's going to hit. And that puts everybody on edge. It puts those of us that have faith into a mode of deep prayer. And just from the social media traffic, I would say that some people are excited, but they're not excited happy. They're excited more of in a panic mode to put the shutters on their house and figure out what to do. Maybe they have children and pets, and there's this whole sort of thing about preparation, but without knowing what's coming. And I think people do get maybe into a depression, like they don't know what to do and they don't feel they can leave because maybe they have a parent who's on oxygen or something like that, and they only have like one tank of gas, and then what are they going to do, sit in traffic? So if you can imagine this whole scenario, and might come every year, so some people may get numb to it. So I'm expecting perhaps that now I'm seeing that there are different responses to the same event.
Absolutely. And so thank you for that. I want to pick up on a couple of things you said. One is you talked about different people responding differently, and that's absolutely true. It's very individual. So someone might get knocked up high for the same trigger that knocks somebody else down low. But similarly, you could see maybe even in that scenario where someone gets really anxious, they get really agitated, and then they think, God, what are we going to have to do? And then they get down, right? So it can be the same trigger. The other thing I want to pick up on is you talked about prayer, but you talked about it as a way that people kind of help deal with that and cope with that, and to deal with some resilience with that. And so what I just wanted to pick up on that is the fact that we already, all of us, have our own practices for bringing ourselves back into our resilience zone, right? The goal of what we're going to talk about is not how do I live in the resilient zone 100% of the time. It's how do I return to the resilient zone more quickly if I recognize that I'm agitated or recognize that I'm knocked down low. The other thing we want to do is we want to realize that through time we can expand our resilient zone. I know people that it doesn't matter what's going on around them. They are calm, cool, collected, present. And then I know other people who it doesn't matter what happens, they're going to get triggered, right? So we all know that people have different bandwidths, if you will, of their resilient zone. And there are ways that we're going to share that will help us expand that. The other thing I want to just mention is, because Elaine said this about hurricanes, is we've built CIT around the best in class of a lot of different programs. We weren't like great inventors that this all came to us in the night. But this is something that this particular set of skills was developed by the Trauma Resource Institute. And they go into crisis zones where, whether it be natural disasters like hurricanes, whether it be terrorists, unfortunately, situations, other kinds, they send in people and they give them these skills because of exactly what Elaine was talking about. So I'm going to move on for time, and that is just so we understand that we each have a resilient zone. We can get knocked up high, we can get knocked down low. And an important component that we'll come to is our early warning for understanding where we are is the sensations in our body. And so the first skill we'll talk about is a skill that we call tracking. And tracking is essentially paying attention to what's going on inside our body, trying to identify whether the sensations in our body are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and then staying with a pleasant or neutral sensation. In a second, I'm going to talk about the autonomic nervous system and how this relates to the autonomic nervous system. But what we're trying to do is differentiate between sensations and emotions or feelings and thoughts. And so what ends up happening is we end up oftentimes thinking in terms of emotions or thoughts. So how are you feeling? Well, I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling down. I'm feeling, my friend is driving me crazy. But if I said, well, how are you feeling in your body? Some people might have a little difficulty with that, or they just don't pay attention to it. And as opposed to saying, well, right now I have some tightness in my chest right here. I have some tingling in my back of my neck right here where the air conditioning or the air is blowing across it. So getting in touch with those sensations is going to be important as we learn this skill. And tracking is what we do to kind of begin to monitor that process. Just basically, it's very as simple as just taking our attention to our body and identifying different sensations, and then being able to identify what is pleasant or neutral. So I'm going to ask you if you don't mind, if you can, and this is everything we do is optional, but if you'll just take your hands in front of you like this, and then rub them back and forth, maybe 4 or 5, 10, 15 times until I say stop. And now stop. And now pay attention to what's going on in your body on the inside. And if you would, maybe just share with me a sensation that you're feeling in the body, that you're noticing in the body. I know I feel a little dampness on my palms from the, I guess, sweat that built up, and a little coolness as the air blows across those palms.
I'm feeling tingling from my hands.
From your hands. Is that a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral?
Very pleasant.
Very pleasant. Excellent. Great. Anybody else?
It's actually made me feel my shoulders.
Make you, and that's not an uncommon thing, is that all of a sudden, and I do this all the time, I'll be sitting in a situation, all of a sudden I'll be like, oh wow, my shoulders are all bunched up, right?
Yeah.
Tight. And I can roll, oh wow, that feels a lot better, right? We don't have a lot of awareness of what's going on in the body oftentimes. So anyone else want to share a sensation that they might be feeling? Why do you think it might be important to notice whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral?
Think of the body as the messenger. And so it's sending us a message.
Excellent. Yeah. It's giving us information. It's giving us information. And as we'll see in a second, it's giving us information that the higher parts of the brain are a lot of times oblivious to, right? We don't even realize it. But the body is sending us all sorts of messages. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of shifting from pleasant to neutral and unpleasant in a second. But if you're knocked up high or knocked down low, what kinds of sensations do you think you'd be experiencing? Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral?
Unpleasant.
Unpleasant. Yeah, oftentimes it's very unpleasant, right? And again, as Elaine said, it's because the body is sending us signals, right? And so it's important as we start to learn this skill as a way of bringing ourselves back into the resilient zone to recognize when that's happening, because that can be a very early warning sign. I might walk into a room and all of a sudden I get tightness in my stomach, and I'm not sure why, but I have tightness in my stomach. If I'm aware of that, I can say, okay, I may be getting up towards the top of my high zone or of my resilient zone. Maybe I should do some tracking, and then we're going to couple that with a practice called resourcing. Now, a resource, Rita had a look of recognition. Was it because of the picture or because of
The picture, that's about 20 miles from my home.
No way. Wow. Where did you say you are in? Where do you live again?
Carbondale, Colorado.
Oh, wow. Yeah. This is actually a photo my father-in-law took, and I think he was in Colorado. So a resource, and did anyone notice the expression on Rita's face? It was just jubilant in my,
Mhm.
I can only try to discern, but it was jubilant, right? And
Yeah.
it was also instantaneous. So that was a great way of helping understand what a resource is. A resource is a person, place, thing, or part of ourselves that when we bring it to mind, helps us feel more resilient, stronger, better. And again, it's important to understand it's something that we bring to mind. And what it does is, by bringing it to mind, it can help us, it will also generate sensations in the body. And what kind of sensations in the body do you think it might generate?
Well, a flash of warmth went through my body when I saw
Okay,
that. Yes.
excellent, excellent. And was it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral?
Very pleasant. Yes.
Very pleasant, right? Very pleasant. And it was very intense, right? That was just such a great example. So yeah, so let's assume for a second that Rita was feeling maybe out of her resilience zone. She was feeling sensations that are related to her being knocked up high or knocked down low. And then she brought this image to her mind. Maybe it's a place that she's visited often. Maybe it's a place that she has a particular memory of being there. And you can look at this image and just maybe imagine the warmth that she experienced being there, the smells, the people she might have been with. All of those things go towards really activating that memory. And the body, the parts of the body that we're going to talk about in a second, the parts of the brain, the parts of the nervous system that generate sensations don't have a real good sense of time. So her body experienced it as if she was in that place at that moment. And it was a very pleasant set of sensations, right? So if she's about to be knocked up high or she is knocked up high, wow, how do you think that would have counteracted that, right? So that's a great example, thank you, Rita, of how we can get into our resilient zone using a resource. And I'm gonna bring that forward. I'm gonna go a little bit more deeply into that in just one second, but I just want to explain a couple other things. The first thing is that a resource can be real or imagined, meaning that it could have been like, for example, I've never been to that place, but after sitting here for the last 3 minutes, looking at that picture and sharing that experience with Rita and starting to describe it in my own mind, that could be a resource for me, even though I've never been there before. It could also be somebody who is a superhero or something, right? That's imagined, a character from a novel, somebody that is an experience or a person that is not real, but just imagined. And that can also have that kind of effect. It can also be an internal or an external quality or external circumstance or event. So it could be that place. It could also be the fact that I'm a really good hiker. I am really strong. It's 10,000 feet to get to that place. And I've done that 10 times and I have really strong legs and I've got really good heart. And so I can, instead of bringing to mind that place, I could bring to mind a quality that I have and allow that to open up what we call a memory capsule, open up those sensations in my body. And then we always throw one more idea out there, which is pets are often great resources. I wanted to see if maybe anybody wanted to just explore a resource with me for a second, because I'd love to just see if anyone wanted to share what might be a resource for you, and then I can kind of help guide you through a process to see and help others see how that can maybe affect our nervous system.
I'll share one. So I keep a picture of my best friend who passed away many years ago right next to my desk. And that's probably my greatest resource. I just look over at that photo and I remember things that he used to say to me that brought me right back to center. So yeah, that's my resource.
Would you mind maybe sharing a particular memory of that? That's a particularly fond memory?
I think my very favorite thing is, people who, we all do this sometimes where we go through the why me, like kind of belly aching. And he would look at me and say, why not you? What
Right.
makes you so special? Why shouldn't, why does everybody else get to suffer and not you? And I was like, whoa, okay. And it would just like bring me right back to center. And yeah.
And do you mind sharing maybe some of the sensations that you're experiencing right now?
Just a lot of warmth. I can feel my cheeks unable to do anything but smile.
Yes.
You know, just remembering this really extraordinary human being, best listener I've ever known in my life. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So that was a very quick example. We can go into a lot more depth. But did anyone, again, notice anything about Maria's affect, her physical appearance as she was, I mean, she pointed some of this out, but anyone else notice that?
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things did you guys notice in her?
Well, her whole tone of voice changed. You know, she was laughing, smiling, very animated.
Yeah. Did anyone have any noticeable change in the sensations in their own body as she was describing that? And if you did, could you maybe share some of that?
You know, it's interesting because I have a friend who lost her partner about a year ago. And so, Maria, when you were telling that story, I thought about her immediately and how she's not able to do what you've just done.
Hmm.
And so that, you know, just hit me because just yesterday, the telephone message hasn't been changed. The Facebook twosome has not been changed, and then to receive a holiday card with both people on the card, it was just it just really resonated about how, you know, where she must be on this resilient zone.
And that, yeah, John, was that you?
Yeah. So I have one that's, it kind of reminded me of something that I actually do. And one of our two daughters had breast cancer 2 years ago. And everyone in our family loves dogs. So what I have is a very, very small little stuffed animal dog of both my daughters and my wife. They're small enough that I can put them in a suitcase and take them with me. So every night, the first thing I do before going to bed is to pick up the dog that looks like our daughter's dog that had the breast cancer, and I visualize compassion. I actually connect the color red to the heart and to compassion. So I actually visualize in my mind this glow of compassion and red surrounding my daughter while I'm holding this little stuffed dog. So it's just interesting that a lot of people have some traumatic event, it sounds like, that they leverage off of to actually find joy and happiness and compassion.
And John, are there any sensations in your body that you can pay attention to or recognize as you're telling us that?
Yeah, just joy, appreciation, gratitude, sense of what's important, a feeling of warmth, and just a calming.
Is the warmth located at any particular place in the body?
In my heart.
In your heart. Excellent. So one of the things just to notice is that a couple of things. One is you started with those more abstract kind of words, which are great, important words like joy and compassion and gratitude. But when we're knocked up high or knocked down low, those kinds of things that we try to say to ourselves don't really help as much as when we notice that, oh, wow, I'm feeling warmth in my heart. And we'll talk about why that is in a second when we get into the brain. But yeah, that's a great. And one other thing I'll mention, as you're thinking about resources, three things I want to point out. One is resources can split, which means that resources that bring us a great sense of well-being or a great sense of strength can also bring up memories that are difficult. So like a loved one that is lost, right, who's passed away, that can also go both ways. If it happens that you are working with a resource that happens with, either practice on trying to adjust your gaze towards the beneficial side, or you can pick another resource, because we're blessed that resources abound in most of our lives, whether they're real or imagined. And then the second thing is, the more detailed you can make a resource, the more powerful it will be, the more of it opening up a real picture. So the senses that you experience during that, the specific words, the, like in maybe Maria's case, the tone of voice, recalling the tone of voice, the smell of being with this person, all of those things are all really important to unlock it. And then the third thing, which is like the money line, is we all do the I'm going to my happy place idea, but what we don't do is we don't pair that with tracking. When we are knocked up high and knocked down low, the higher parts of the brain aren't thinking so great, right? Which is why we make decisions that we later perhaps regret, or we're not being our best self. So if we are bringing this person or this thing or this experience to mind, it may not have a huge effect if we don't track the pleasant or neutral sensations that are going on in the body at the same time. And so to kind of explain that, if we were doing CIT, we would do a reflective writing and mindful dialogue, which we're not going to do. And that would just be an opportunity to really kind of flesh out a few resources and then pair up with another partner and kind of do what we just did, sharing it. But part of it, this all kind of comes down to and relates back to the brain. And in particular, we'll talk about in a second, the autonomic nervous system. But a real simple way of understanding the brain, and let me start with a caveat, which is any model of the brain is at best a heuristic to help us get a sense of what's going on in there. But at about 1 billion neurons and 10,000 connections each, we're still a long way from being able to draw like a really precise picture. But this is a helpful heuristic, I believe. And that is, if we think about the brain as a kind of a 3-layered structure, we can also think about it using our hand, where the arm is the spine, and here at the base we have what some call the reptilian brain, or this lower level of the brain called the survival brain. And the survival brain is the part that runs basically all of the things that we don't have to think about. All of our digestion, our respiration, all of those systems that we don't have to think about, and it just reacts to stimuli. And there is no language or no concepts, no joy, no nothing down here, right? This is the world of sensation. If you layer on top of that your thumb, you then get the limbic brain. And the limbic brain can also be thought of as the mammalian brain, can be thought of as the emotion part of the brain. And here we have the amygdala and the hippocampus and some other structures that are related to emotion, but also related to tracking the environment for safety. Am I in a safe environment where I can go into my rest and digest mode, my social engagement mode, or am I in a situation where I have to engage fight or flight? Again, there's not really any language going on down here, because all of that happens when we layer our fingers over the top and we get to our cortical part of the brain, where we have thought, we have logic, we have reason, we have the most advanced, kind of most recently developed part of the brain. And ideally, all 3 of these parts of the brain are working in concert, right? We're thinking reasonably, rationally, but we notice emotion, we take emotion into account, we understand what's going on in our body, and everything's working great. When we get knocked up high or knocked down low, we do what we call flip the lid, right? So this part of the brain goes offline. This part of the brain takes over because it goes into a fight or flight mode. Or in the worst case scenario, it goes into a freeze mode. But it goes into a fight or flight mode where it's taking over and sending signals not up, and these signals aren't coming from up to down, they're going straight down into the sensing part of the body. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to understand and track sensations. Because if my amygdala and my limbic system begins to recognize pleasant sensations in the body, or at least neutral sensations, it can start to turn the smoke detector down a little bit and clear out the false alarms. So it's really important that that last piece of tracking is really, really critical. And I can't emphasize that enough. Now, all of this, and please stop me at any point if there's questions.
I have a question,
Yeah,
Mike.
please, John.
Would you mind, where does affective empathy fit in all that? The actual feeling, not the understanding of someone else's emotions or interpreting someone else's emotions, but the actual gut-like feeling of someone else's emotions.
Yeah, so that's going to happen mostly in the limbic area.
Mhm.
And then as you so beautifully just said, the theory of mind part of the brain, the part that's doing the perspective taking is much more in the cortical part of the brain. We had someone in a class, I got this through a facilitator, was saying, in the course, we talk a little bit about how you have affective and cognitive, and how if you have the cognitive without the affective, then you could be very manipulative, or even go as far as to say you could be a psychopath, right? And the person said, well, that's not empathy if the person has cognitive empathy. And we had to go back and say, well, actually, it is still empathy, right? But it's coming from a different part of the mind or a different part of the brain. It's a different skill set. It's a capacity of the mind to understand what is going on with the other, but it doesn't have those same sorts of bodily changes, the bodily sensations, right, that relate to what's going on in the limbic and then sending it down.
So how much can you actually, relatively speaking, can you actually teach affective empathy, feeling someone else's pain, versus how much can you teach understanding someone else's feeling?
So a lot of that is going to be related to both, well, first of all, the perspective taking, the cognitive empathy is a one channel into the affective empathy when it's not just natural. But the other thing is we find that teaching it through common humanity is a huge piece of it, because what happens is when I see somebody who I identify in my in-group, then I have much more affective empathy with that person, right? Just naturally, it's part of how I'm wired. If I can train myself more and more to see that stranger as part of the in-group, then I'm going to have more and more affective empathy naturally for that person as well, because my brain is not immediately putting them outside, right? So that's one way of doing it, right, is just being able to see more and more people as a human being just like me. So there are practices we can do with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to jump forward a little bit and just to say that, so it relates to the autonomic nervous system. Some of you have heard this metaphor where we have the sympathetic nervous system. Again, this is all down in that lower part of the brain. Sympathetic nervous system like the accelerator, where the parasympathetic nervous system is like the brake. And what that looks like in practice is that with the sympathetic nervous system, you're going from basically 0 to 100 fast, right? And all of these systems in your body that are designed to save you, to prepare you for fight or flight, are kicking in. And it's very adaptive. When I was talking to a family member the other day who walked into his boss's office in a very difficult situation, and he felt he couldn't breathe. And his boss was like, well, what's wrong with you? Did you just like run up the stairs to get here? And he didn't really understand what was going on, is that his autonomic nervous system was in overdrive, right? He had adrenaline pumping through his body, his heart rate was speeding up, his respiratory. So all of these things are happening without him. He wasn't like thinking, oh, I want to start breathing really heavy right now, and I want to start getting jittery right now. It's his body reacted to the feeling of threat. And so it's all very natural and it's very adaptive. This is, very healthy for us to be able to have this. The problem is that we oftentimes perceive threat when it really doesn't exist in the same way. And that's when we get knocked up high and we want to bring ourselves back into the resilient zone. The other way of the brake, right, is when we're slamming on that brake and we're slowing things down, and the exact opposite will happen. And this is how we can go into rest and digest. Which, by the way, when we're shifting, you'll oftentimes, people will sometimes burp, or they might let out gas, or they might gurgle in their stomach, and people are so embarrassed by that. Oh, I can't believe but the reality is that's just a sign that they're releasing and shifting into the parasympathetic nervous system. It's actually a great sign when that happens. Or when somebody shivers, they're releasing some of that built up energy. So those are all good signs. So the idea here is to learn how we can regulate the autonomic nervous system up and down. And it's really important, just like I said before, everybody's ranges are different. Everybody's reactions are different, because we all have an autonomic nervous system that is designed to help us survive. But then that gets shaped over time via life experience. And it may be shaped over time particularly through trauma. And there's two different kinds of trauma that are typically studied. One is what they call big T trauma, where things happen too much too fast. And that could be the hurricane situation. It could be all sorts of situations. One of the things we stress over and over again is that perception is key. This is not about judging somebody and saying, well, that wasn't a trauma. You should hear what happened to me, right? It's how the body perceives it. And if the body perceives it, it's going to store it in the body, in the mind, and react to situations differently based on that. There's also what they call little t trauma and cumulative trauma, where things happen much more slowly over time. And this is where it can have the same effect on the nervous system. It's also perception being very important. And this is interesting because this is a whole area of research where a lot of people have perhaps historically been shamed for saying, well, nothing really happened because you didn't experience, you know, a wartime situation or a hurricane or something like that. You just were neglected as a child, right? Just neglected as a child. Small doses over long periods of time can also have the same effects. And so understanding our own nervous system, our own life experiences, our own resilience zone is really important. So I'm going to actually stop it there. And there's one more skill. So the 3 skills we teach in skill 1 is calming body and mind is tracking, resourcing, and grounding. Grounding is another form of bringing ourselves back into our resilient zone that we pair with tracking. But I just wanted to stop there and open it up for questions, thoughts. My goal today was to talk a little bit about the science, but also to make sure that people walked out with maybe a tool that they could put in practice that could help with this. Because when we talk about the science of compassion, I'm lousy at being compassionate when I'm out of my resilient zone. So hopefully bringing ourselves back in will help others as it has helped me. So that's the part I wanted to get to last time, and I'm glad we got to it this time, Marilyn. So now we can open it up for comments, questions, anywhere you want it to go.
Okay, well, Mimi, would you turn people's microphones on so they won't have to worry about doing it?
John Selwood, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to share anything, or you just?
I'm sorry, I'm just generally being unmuted. But
Okay,
I do have a question, actually. If we accept that we are communities of collaboration, that we form networks of tribes, which in and of themselves create an in-group bias, how do we go about tackling within that group the notion that empathy can be good and bad? How do you make the place where someone is already captured by their own in-group bias, a place where they can see outwards? What possible snap could there be? I know it's kind of slightly off, but it intrigues me, because if we're all empathetic from an evolutionary perspective, how do we do that?
So you're saying, how do you help people see beyond in-group bias to say that even though you identify that person as out of your in-group,
Yeah.
I want to help you see that they're not?
Yeah.
So a couple of things, I don't know if that was a softball question because you're in CIT, but a couple of things we do in CIT that we find helpful is, the first thing is among other, we do a number of different things, but things that are jumping out at me. In skill 6, we do something called an interdependence drawing. We ask people, and this is a thought experiment you can do with anybody sitting at a coffee shop, and you say to them, and what we do is we get people into small groups and we say, pick an item, any item that you guys can come up with that you find might be something you take for granted but is actually of value to you. And different people will pick different things, and the group will come together and they pick, each small group picks one item. So it might be the projector on the ceiling if we're doing this in person. And they put that up on a piece of paper. And then we ask them to map everything that it took for that projector to be there. So they have to put up all of the parts that were part of that, and all of the manufacturing processes, and the person who actually brought it into the room and hung it on the ceiling, and the person who drove it there, and the manufacturing of the car, and the parts of the car. And eventually people get back to dinosaurs, because you needed dinosaurs to have petroleum in order to fuel the cars. And so at the very end of that exercise, we say, give us a number. How many people did it take for that projector to be in this room? And you'll either get every person who's ever survived on this, ever lived on this planet, to 7 billion people, to people. Some people are smaller minded, they come up with like 3 or 4 million, but in no case do they come up with 5 or 10. And then the next question is, how many of those people do you know? And clearly the vast majority of them they do not know, if not 99.99% of them. And do you see that object differently? Do you see those people differently? And so that's just the projector. And then we start to connect the drawings, right? Because somebody else did a cup of coffee. Well, how many cups of coffee were drunk by the people who were building that projector? And then, oh, this guy over here had a light bulb. Well, the light bulb needed to be in the projector. So now you've got everybody. So when you're actually, I try to do a practice that when I see people, strangers, I don't just think to myself, oh, that's a human being just like me. I say that's a human being that benefits everything I do every day in some way that I have no idea about. So that's one. And the last, another thing, and there's various different ways. Another thing we can do is we do systems maps. Another thing is the empathy line, where we have people stand on a line, or we can do this electronically. But basically what we say is, on one wall is 0 empathy, on the other wall is total empathy. And we say a scenario. So for example, a teacher is, not a teacher, you hear of a child being bullied. How much empathy do you have for the child? And people rate themselves, they walk along the line or they put a number. And then we change the scenario a little bit. Well, you found out that, how much empathy do you have for the bully? And then they change and they talk about why. And then we say, also we add scenarios. By the end of it, almost everybody has a tremendous amount of empathy. And what it took was just more details. And when we ask people to describe why they had empathy at a particular point in time, it was because, well, I was bullied as a child, or I was the bully as a child, or wait, now you're telling me the bully is a teacher? That should never be. Or I'm a teacher, I can understand where they might. It's all based on their own identification with this person. And then when you finally ask the question, is that a reasonable basis to have empathy? Just based on how you happen to identify with the person? When as you go further and further, you get more and more reasons to understand that this person is just like you. So those are a couple, one of the things that we're adding, the concept that we're adding to, we're not changing any content, but one concept we're adding is the idea of, we're going to call it thinking traps, which is not an uncommon thought. But these cognitive distortions that we commonly have, that we need these kinds of cognitive tools to help us see through. So I don't see this cup of coffee as anything but this cup of coffee in this moment that I happen to make. So I am fully responsible for this cup of coffee. The idea that billions of people are behind this is not seen by me. But I can train my mind to see through that, because the reality, it's not like I'm trying to see Pollyanna. The reality is the billions of people that went into this coffee. I don't see reality. I want to see reality more clearly, because the reality will get me towards that empathy. That's just some ideas that we have.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I hope this doesn't take us too far off track, but has anybody read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi?
I have not read it, but I've heard interviews with him.
Yeah, it's kind of reminds me of some of the things. It's kind of tough reading, frankly. But a lot of what he suggests is that, he makes the case that it's not enough to say, a lot of people say I'm not a racist, but he goes beyond that, I think, to challenge people to see some of the systems and some of the wider realities, in order to get to the point where you would say, well, it's not enough not to be a racist. I have to think more about what systems or what actions or what has to be undone, So I'm reminded of that by what you said about that practice of thinking about everything that went into things, Anyway, so to try to put together this issue of racism and compassion it's a big challenge, I think.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
It is, and that's when we get into, that's why we get into systems. And when we look at those systems, we say, because I might say, I am so very compassionate, and so I'm going to not be a racist, as
right,
opposed to saying, well, let me look at the entire system and recognize
right.
where I might be part of that system.
Exactly.
And we talk about different layers of what we call violence that comes out of peace studies, but the idea of direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. And so I think, to his point, Kendi's point, is that I don't participate in direct violence in terms of racism, but perhaps I do participate in structures, or I do participate in cultures.
Mhm.
And so then how can I, if I'm compassionate, how can I look at that system in a way that addresses it on those multiple
Right.
levels?
Exactly. I think that's
Okay.
exactly where it, well, you have to read it to see if you think that's what he's saying, but I think there's a lot of that involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions or thoughts? You can be specific about the skills that we talked about if you have any questions about that before you. By the way, just so you know, this is not just an advertisement for signing up for CIT, because all of the materials are available on our website for free. So you can download the full manual, you can download audio podcasts, you can download audio practices. So if you want to explore any of this in greater detail, clearly it's more effective if you have a guide to walk you through it, but and others to share it with. But we want people just to be able to access this stuff and begin to work with it.
And it is a commercial now, because we do have 2 compassionate integrity trainings coming up in January. One that's primarily for folks who would be from the US to Europe, and the other that would accommodate other places in the world. So you can take a look right on the charter
I will say
homepage.
Marilyn is going to be one of the facilitators for the Thursdays, 7 to 9,
Thursdays. Yeah,
Thursdays, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern time.
Eastern time, right. And I wanted to not remind you, because you probably don't even know this, but our first global read in January is with Paul Gilbert. And you'll remember that you had an opening article from Paul Gilbert, and so he will be coming to us live. I think the date is January 16th, but you can check again on the homepage to see. And the person who is going to be the facilitator for that is a colleague of his. Paul works out of the UK, but Lynn Reeder is from Australia, and she's a researcher, so she'll be the facilitator. And one to watch for is it May or June, Michael?
May.
We have Christine Neff, and Michael's going to be the facilitator for that global read. So you can start reading now.
Come join
tell
us.
your friends, come join us. Yeah, we're coming close to the end of this, and so I'm wondering if anyone does have any comments, and we can get those out now, or questions.
Marilyn, I think one of the most commented on topics in this whole Science of Compassion course has been, do you really have to feel suffering in order to be empathetic?
I think that's interesting, because I always kind of look at compassion as being a continuum. Somewhere you pick up on an issue, most often through empathy, and then you really, I think, begin to confront yourself with what are you actually going to do about it. And it's in the act of moving forward. I mean, you have a deep, intense feeling. I know, for years, I've spent an incredible amount of time in India, and I know that people think, oh, you know, I could never go to India because I would just feel so overwhelmed and so depressed that I would almost be in a catatonic state because I couldn't do anything. But I think that, you know, if I put on a comment yesterday on the Rizuku platform that, and I love this comment when I first, or this quote when I first saw it. It's from George Orwell, and he said, "We have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them accordingly." And so, you know, so that I think that when you see or you hear, you know, something, an issue, an act, an event, that causes you great concern, it makes your heart ache, that you have to begin the process, how can I help? And how can I help could be so small, like turning off the water. Instead, when you're filling out the jug and then you turn around and do something, that's an act of compassion because of the fact that we need to have regard for, you know, the state of water in the world. Or it could be, you know, really committing ourselves to volunteering in a food kitchen or a pantry. So, you know, but we're not suffering at the level that the people who are dying of thirst, or there's a drought that is in process, or the fact that, you know, our health is so impaired. So it's a very natural kind of question, but I think that it's a matter of seeing and hearing, and then. And I always find another skill is asking the question. And so often, I have a friend who always says when she encounters something, she'll say, "What do you need?" And oftentimes people will give an answer, and it's not the answer that you want to hear, but you know, it is the one that you really need to consider, and that would be the act of compassion.
I'm not sure if I'm asking this question that Elaine was asking, but in a different way. And Elaine, I apologize if I'm not doing it correctly, but I think maybe what I'm wondering is, does we all almost intrinsically, instinctively feel the pain of others? The question I have, and maybe this is Elaine's question, is do we have to actively go out and push ourselves to feel more pain of others, or is it just going to come naturally? And the thing we need to really focus on is not, can I suffer more with others, but how do I respond when I recognize that others are suffering, and I emotionally am, you know, caught up in their suffering.
I'm not sure, John, because I do see that there's 2 different questions here. I think that I don't think that we have to, you know, I mean, definitely we take on another person's suffering by the act of doing something about it, whether it be, you know, an act of kindness or whatever. So I'm not sure how to answer your question. I don't know, Michael, do you have?
I'll share a couple thoughts, and maybe you can tell me if I'm actually hitting the question, because I'm not totally positive. But
yeah.
the first is that I think it's important to feel a sense of suffering with the other. But at the same time, we don't want to become overwhelmed by that suffering, because you mentioned, John, becoming overwhelmed by it can then paralyze us. And we then are motivated to turn away from it, right? So that's more empathic distress and empathic concern.
Yeah.
And so some of the skills, for example, that I just talked about are ones that I utilize in the presence of suffering, right? Because I know that I'm getting knocked up high, I'm getting knocked down low in relation to this, because of my empathy. And so I've got to be able to modulate that. And so that's why self-compassion is such a critical piece of it. So that's number one. And the second thing is that we can use just a little bit of that feeling to be able to go a long way in terms of our cognitive empathy, right? To realize this is suffering that a lot of people feel. Where else are people feeling this suffering? Where else can I have an impact? And that gets back to the idea of looking at a system, of really understanding it. And to Marilyn's point is recognizing that there are lots of different ways I can engage in that system, both small and large, depending on my means, depending on my time, depending on what I can dedicate my life to. And I think it's really important too within self-compassion to recognize that we need to have realistic expectations of ourselves, because flogging ourselves for not being compassionate enough or not doing enough is gonna paralyze us. So just a couple of quick thoughts about how we work.
Yeah, I think that it's almost impossible to know what another person's suffering is. I mean, we can associate with it, but to really know the depth of it and the effect of it, it is something that's almost impossible. And I know, great plays and things have been written around this. I understand your suffering. You'll never understand my suffering. And that's why I feel that oftentimes when I'm faced with a dilemma where I really know that I need to do something, I oftentimes will find myself saying to the person, what is it that you need? Because sometimes, we just don't know.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to need to.
Yeah,
I'm going to need to
we're a
scoot.
few minutes off. But
it
thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. It was wonderful to see some of you again. And John, great to see you, John Selwood, down in New Zealand. Finish up your facilitator training. And hopefully we'll see some of you guys in future courses. And it was delightful to spend time with you. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.